In June of 1941, German officers gathered around a knocked-out Soviet tank and realized they had a serious problem. It was faster than anything they had. Its sloped armor shrugged off their shells. Before long, German generals at the front were asking Berlin for the simplest solution imaginable: just copy it. That tank was the T-34, and it existed because 11 years earlier, the United States Army had rejected the American inventor who designed its heart. Every weapon in this video has the same origin story. A genius walked in the front door, the generals said no, and the idea walked out the back door into history, usually wearing someone else's uniform. A patent for the jet engine, allowed to expire over a 5-pound renewal fee. A rifle so far ahead of its time that the President of the United States had to test fire it himself to overrule his own army. A boat builder from Louisiana, the Navy, fought for a decade, until Eisenhower called him the man who won the entire war, and one officer whose rejection was answered with a court-martial. His apology arrived 16 years later at 7:55 on a Sunday morning. 5 weapons, 5 rejection letters, 5 apologies that came too late. Walter Christie was a hot-tempered engineer from New Jersey who raced cars, built fire engines, and believed a tank should move like neither. In 1928, after 5 years and $382,000 of mostly his own money, he unveiled a suspension system unlike anything on Earth. Where other tanks crawled on rigid springs, Christie's design let each wheel swing through enormous travel, soaking up rough ground at speeds no armored vehicle had ever survived. Running on its wheels alone, later Soviet testers would clock his machine at 43 miles an hour, in an era when most tanks struggled to reach 10. The United States Army tested it, argued about it, and walked away. And to be fair, Christie made it easy. He blew deadlines, took money from Poland for a tank he never delivered, and treated the Ordnance Department like an obstacle instead of a customer. When the War Department later invited him to submit a design for the competition that eventually produced the Sherman, he wrote back that their specifications did not conform to the advanced art of tank construction. He may even have been right. He was also finished in Washington. So Christie went looking for a customer who would say yes, and found one in Moscow. On April 28, 1930, his company signed a contract with the Soviet Trade Office. 2 tanks, plus full production rights inside the Soviet Union for 10 years, for $60,000. No State Department approval, no Army sign-off. The 2 vehicles were stripped of their turrets, falsely documented as agricultural farm tractors, and shipped out on December 24, 1930, Christmas Eve. Soviet engineers studied them down to the last bolt, loved what they found, and built their entire BT series of fast tanks on Christie's running gear. Then they took the next step. They married his suspension and his sloped armor, thinking to a bigger gun and a diesel engine. And in 1940, the result rolled out of the factory as the T-34, arguably the most consequential tank of the Second World War, built by the tens of thousands, riding on a rejected American design. The British came asking too. After their attaches watched BT tanks perform at Soviet maneuvers in 1936, the War Office bought Christie's last remaining prototype, the one he had mortgaged just to stay afloat, for $320,000. It also left America labeled as a farm tractor, with the turret shipped separately in a crate marked grapefruit. That single purchase fathered Britain's whole cruiser tank line, from the Crusader to the Cromwell. And Christie? His company had already collapsed into receivership. He kept offering designs to the US Army into the 1940s, and the Army kept declining. He died in Virginia on January 11th, 1944, while tens of thousands of tanks carrying his suspension fought toward Berlin. The New York Times wrote the American ending of the story in a single obituary headline: Tank developer dies penniless. Christie's sin, if you can call it that, was being impossible to work with. The next man was polite, brilliant, wore the uniform, and followed every rule. It didn't help him at all. In 1929, a young Royal Air Force officer named Frank Whittle worked out that a gas turbine could push an aircraft to speeds and heights no propeller would ever touch. He sent the idea up the chain. The Air Ministry handed it to a senior scientist who found what he took to be an error in the calculations and stamped the whole concept impractical. In January 1930, Whittle patented the jet engine anyway. He was 22 years old. Then the ministry did something worse than saying no. Because it had no interest in the idea, it declined to classify the patent as secret. So when the patent was granted in 1932, the complete specification of the jet engine was published openly, worldwide, for anyone on the planet to read, including engineers in Germany. By 1935, Whittle was a struggling junior officer with a growing family, and the patent came up for renewal. The fee was £5. The Air Ministry refused to pay it. Whittle could not afford it himself. And so the patent on the invention of the century was simply allowed to die. Britain owned the jet age for the price of a round at the pub and chose to keep the money. 2 retired RAF men eventually tracked Whittle down, scraped together private backing and a bank loan of £2,000, and founded a tiny company called Power Jets. The Air Ministry graciously permitted Whittle to work on his own engine for 6 hours per week. On April 12, 1937, in the corner of a turbine factory, the first Whittle engine roared into life, shrieking like an air raid siren, while patches of its casing glowed red hot and grown men backed toward the doors. It was the first practical jet engine on Earth. It was also too late to be first in the sky. On August 27, 1939, 5 days before the invasion of Poland, a German aircraft made the world's first jet-powered flight. Whittle's engine did not fly until May of 1941. His designs went on to power the Meteor, the fighter that hunted V-1 flying bombs over England, and a Whittle engine shipped across the Atlantic kick-started the entire American jet program. After the war, a royal commission awarded him £100,000, and the king made him a knight, which is a generous way of admitting that the empire's most important invention had once been worth less than £5 to the men in charge of it. Sometimes the generals ignore an idea quietly, and sometimes they ignore it so hard that the President of the United States has to walk into a park and fire the weapon himself. In 1860, a Connecticut machinist named Christopher Spencer patented a rifle that should have shortened the Civil War by years. 7 shots fed from a tube in the stock, fired as fast as a man could work the lever, in an age when a good soldier managed 3 shots a minute from a muzzleloader. The Union's chief of ordnance, General James Ripley, looked at it and saw a nightmare. Special cartridges, new supply lines, and worst of all, in his view, soldiers who would waste ammunition. He dismissed repeating rifles as newfangled gimcracks and buried the design under paperwork. The soldiers in the field disagreed. In Indiana, Colonel John Wilder was so convinced that he arranged bank loans, backed by his own personal guarantee, so his men could buy Spencers with their own money. Stop and think about that. Union soldiers took out private loans to purchase the rifle their own army refused to issue them. In June of 1863, at Hoover's Gap in Tennessee, Wilder's brigade used those Spencers to shatter a Confederate force far larger than itself, and rode out of the fight with a new name, the Lightning Brigade. 2 months later, Christopher Spencer did perhaps the most American thing ever recorded. He walked into the White House carrying a rifle, was shown in to see Abraham Lincoln, and the following day, the President of the United States stood in a park near the Treasury building, worked the lever, and put 7 rounds into a wooden board. Lincoln was impressed. Orders followed. Ripley was eased out as Chief of Ordnance that September, and by the end of the war, more than 100,000 Spencers had reached Union troops. Confederate soldiers captured plenty of them, and it did them almost no good because the South could not manufacture the copper rimfire cartridges. The rejected rifle became the one weapon the enemy could steal but never use. It took the commander-in-chief, standing in a park with a gun in his hands, to overrule his own experts. Lincoln could overrule his generals with a signature. The officer in the next story had nobody above the generals to appeal to, so they destroyed him instead. And then everything he predicted came true, almost to the minute. Billy Mitchell came out of the First World War as America's most famous airman, carrying one unshakable conviction. The battleship's reign was over, because aircraft could sink anything that floats. The establishment found this laughable. The Secretary of War declared the idea so nonsensical that he offered to personally stand on the bridge of any ship Mitchell attacked. In 1921, Mitchell finally got his test. The target was the captured German battleship Ostfriesland, a ship considered close to unsinkable, and the rules were stacked against him, with limited hits allowed, smaller bombs first, and the target anchored 50 miles offshore to cut his time overhead. On July 21st, his bombers arrived with 2,000-pound bombs, and the unsinkable battleship rolled over and went to the bottom in roughly 20 minutes. Some of the Navy officers watching from the observation ships were reportedly in tears. The official response was to explain it all away. The ship was anchored. The ship was empty. It proved nothing, and that was even half true. But Mitchell kept pushing, and in 1924, he came back from an inspection tour of the Pacific with a 324-page report predicting war with Japan. It would begin, he wrote, with a surprise air attack on Pearl Harbor, and he put a time on it, an attack on Ford Island at 7:30 in the morning. The War Plans Division dismissed the report as exaggerated and unsound. In fairness, Mitchell got one detail wrong. He assumed the attack would come from island air bases rather than aircraft carriers. He got nearly everything else right. In 1925, after an airship disaster killed 14 men, Mitchell publicly accused his own leadership of almost treasonable administration of the national defense. President Coolidge personally ordered his court-martial. 7 weeks, roughly 100 witnesses, and a guilty verdict reached in 3 hours. Suspended for 5 years without pay, Mitchell resigned his commission and spent the last decade of his life shouting into the wind. He died in February 1936, still insisting the attack was coming. On December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor at 7:55 on a Sunday morning, 25 minutes off Mitchell's estimate, and hit the Philippines hours later, just as his report had laid out. 3 days after that, aircraft sank the battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse in open water. The apology came in pieces. Roosevelt had Mitchell posthumously promoted to Major General. Congress struck a gold medal in his honor. And in April 1942, America's first strike back at Japan was flown by bombers officially named the Mitchell, the only American military aircraft ever named after a person. They took off, of all places, from the deck of an aircraft carrier. Every story so far ends with an apology addressed to a dead man. The last one is different, because this time the rejected outsider lived long enough to watch the United States Navy come begging. Andrew Higgins built boats in New Orleans, shallow draft workboats for trappers and oilmen, designed to run straight up onto a mudbank, take a beating, and back off again. As war approached, Higgins insisted these were exactly what an invasion fleet needed. The Navy's Bureau of Ships preferred its own designs, and for years the Bureau fought him, stalled him, and kept losing to him in head-to-head trials. The boat's final ingredient came from an insult. In 1937, a young marine observer named Victor Krulak photographed Japanese landing craft in China, dropping bow ramps so troops could run straight onto the beach. He sent a detailed report to Washington. Years later, he found it buried in a file, dismissed as the work of some nut out in China. So Krulak took the idea to Higgins in person, and Higgins had a ramped prototype in the water within weeks. The result was the LCVP, the Higgins boat. When the begging finally came, it was total. A company with 75 employees in 1938 grew past 20,000 workers, and by late 1943, more than 90% of the vessels in the entire United States Navy were Higgins designs. On June 6, 1944, his boats put the Allied armies onto the beaches of Normandy, ramps down, under fire, exactly as a Louisiana boat builder had promised for a decade. 20 years later, Dwight Eisenhower delivered history's verdict in a single sentence, calling Higgins the man who won the war for us. The Navy spent 10 years fighting the boat. The boat then carried the Navy's entire war ashore. So look at what actually got rejected in these 5 stories, because it was never the weapon. Christie was difficult, Whittle was junior, Spencer was a civilian, Mitchell was loud, Higgins was an outsider with a Louisiana accent. The ideas were sound, the men were simply the wrong kind of men, and the institutions punished the messengers until reality left them no choice but to buy the message. And notice when the begging finally arrives. Never when the evidence shows up, only when the alternatives run out. Britain begged for jets while flying bombs fell on London. The Navy ordered 20,000 boats from the man it had ignored. And America named a bomber after an officer it had court-martialed, then launched it from the deck of a ship. The apology always comes. It just tends to arrive after the funeral. If you enjoyed this, hit subscribe, because this is exactly what we do here. The real verdict on the machine's history would rather forget. I will see you in the next one.